So when I jumped into the world of community technology and I was building these really small computer labs, I tell people the story that I actually went to Chicago and I had no family there. And my family is basically very big. My mother has 15 brothers and sisters. My father has 7. So I show up in a city and I have no relatives, no distant cousins, no aunts, no uncles. And I felt pride of alone. And I met this man in the parking lot. He said, well, come volunteer. And these people in this 300 Chicago with these computer labs, and he actually worked with me to build and design these spaces. And so you picked up on that in terms of because part of what we tried to do in building these local computer labs was not just to put, I'm gonna date myself, I know I don't look that much older, 386 computers that were barely working in a computer lab, but we tried to actually make the space beautiful. And beautiful for people, and the book is aptly titled Digitally Invisible, beautiful for people who are invisible, and that's, for me, this book is very much an ode and dedication to him, because without him, I wouldn't have been able to, until this day, sort of reimagine space and place. But it's also her too. She was a school teacher. She's still alive, and she was very much an influence in all of her daughters' ability to stay focused on school. So I just had to put that out there.
So I didn't know the part about your dad being an architect,
yes.
And that makes it even more interesting for me to imagine. There's a part of me that's still in that cubbyhole thing.
Yes.
In Chicago, which describe a little bit. And by the way, the book. Oh, actually, let me stop myself, because the cover of the book is stunning. It's a beautiful cover. How did that come about? Did you?
Well, if I could see your book for just a moment.
Sure.
So it came about, and it's really interesting. The title came, actually, I have to be honest. So I wanted to name it something with digital in it, and I see Larry Irving is here, and I've been friends with him for so many decades as well. So I didn't want to name it Digital Divide, but I thought that would be kind of cool. And then I ran across Richard Reeves, who used to be at Brookings at a Christmas party, and he was like, that's going to be completely boring. You need something else. He's British, and they tell their and speak their mind, so I accepted it, and moved on. But Digitally Invisible came, and the artwork came, because when I was writing the book, I kept living in this space as a Black woman, a woman of color in tech, that I was invisible. I've been in DC for 30 years. I've been doing this work for a long time. And I felt still that there were not enough of us. We're like hidden figures, gems within a P, where my invisibility showed up in this particular woman. So when I asked the graphic designer to create the cover, I didn't want to use photo stock. I actually wanted people, right? Because for me, they represented my invisibility. And I also, when you read the book, framed it on Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which was one of my favorite books in high school, because Ralph Ellison basically portrayed, I think, the experiences of a lot of marginalized populations where we try and do everything we're supposed to. We get a good education, we show up in the right places, but yet it doesn't matter. We're still invisible. And at some point in the book, he falls into this bunker and nobody knows he's missing, even though he was this person that kept trying to be recognized and known and acknowledged. He literally went underneath in the ground for so many months. And so the cover is a reflection of that, right? Not because of the stories that I tell in the book about these visible people, but it was also like a recognition of my own invisibility in this space. And the need for me to use this graphic where somebody could identify with somebody on this cover to realize that this is maybe not a Black and white thing. Maybe it's not a woman thing. Maybe it's a notion of who we actually decide to see when we are actually thinking about technology. So there's a story to it. You're gonna make me cry again. First you talk about my daddy, now you're talking about the cover, right? But there was a method to really creating this,
right,
which I was very pleased with the result.
It's again, for a policy wonk book, it's a stunning cover. You acknowledge Larry in the room.
He's one of the characters.
Please introduce Larry Irving and why he was important to this story.
Well, Larry Irving is so important to so many people in this space because when he was sitting in the Clinton administration, he actually came up with this concept of the digital divide. And I'll never forget actually meeting Larry, because I think at that time I was still in graduate school with Charlie Benton and Don Samuelson. And all these reports were coming out of the Department of Commerce around the time of Clinton. And they were talking about the haves and the have-nots. And here was Larry, this guy kind of remember your hair. You had hair back then. A little bit of hair back then. And you were there at a time with like Ron Brown and Mickey Leland was in Congress. And I was an outsider at that time. I wasn't an insider. But we followed him, right? Because he had something to say about this experience I was having with these 386 computers and these modems that screeched, "You got mail." People remember that, America Online. There was this guy in Washington basically saying, we have the haves and the have-nots. And a gentleman, I think Jim McConaughey was there at the time, was actually this as a researcher, he was this huge policy data wonk that was putting out all these reports falling through the net. And I read them. That was a space that I thought was really interesting because I was sitting in this utility room with these folks who were essentially living out this experience. So I tell a lot of young people, for me, and a lot of folks say, well, how did you get into policy? A lot of it has to do with my lived experience of seeing how policy was playing out in Chicago at the time. But, outside of being a mentor, a friend, just a wonderful husband and a dog owner and all these other great things, Larry, I think for many of us, gave us some vernacular to actually talk about this issue. And he gave us not only the vernacular, but the data, as well as some foresight into what the internet was going to become. And I really wanted to argue and continue to make the arguments that a lot of what we talk about with what he coined as the digital divide back in the 90s, the unfortunate thing is we're still there because we still define it the same way, despite us being really rapidly dismissive of anything that's inline or analog. We live in a very digitized society where we live, we learn, we earn, we communicate, we love, we do all these things. And it's so different from sort of the dichotomy of what I experienced back in the 90s with people who just needed to get online to apply for a job. And so he really, I think, helped us create a language for this and to create a policy path, which at the time for folks, again, I'm dating myself. I was doing this back in the late 90s. I was sitting in a computer lab as part of the Community Technology Center movement. And it didn't make sense, the internet. It didn't make sense. I was like, I don't know what people are worried about. I was in college. I had the intranet and the internet myself. But now as we fast forward 30 years later, many administrations later, it's still not making as much sense. And it didn't make sense then. So I think we all love Larry for the reasons that, he straightforward, but he really helped us to define something that has grown and morphed into, an area which we probably can't even define because it's moving so quickly. That's what you do.
We're all in this, this journey together. Well, actually, the book reads like a heroine's journey.
Yeah.
And take us from the outskirts of New York City to Chicago. What, you're a grad student at this point?
I was a grad student. Yes, I was. Looking for a cousin. Essentially looking for some Thanksgiving dinner every once in a while and a home cooked meal.
and talk about some of the characters you encountered and who almost became family to you in that lab.
Yeah, so it was really funny. When I was working on the book, I had a lot of stories. And actually, I happened to listen to Malcolm Gladwell on the plane back from Barcelona. I was coming back from an AI conference because I do that as well. And he said, you cannot tell every story. Like, basically, you have a lot of content, but you can't tell every story. So I decided to talk about, like, what stories then really impacted me. And so for people who don't know, I literally went around the country. I see Kim from Apple. And I was like, where do I want to go? And so I decided I was going to try to go to places and spaces that I had been in contact with where I knew someone. I wanted to also go to policy spaces. So there's a really huge emphasis on reaching out to the schools and libraries that benefited from Obama's Connect Ed program, because I knew that there would be some things I could actually control if there were groups that actually had some government interaction over the course of these last 30 years. And so what was interesting, I started the book with this story of a young girl named Kiana. So I'm the computer lady, right? So this is the hard thing about a policy book. You kind of think about policy books, and I read a lot of them, and you're like, who's going to read my book? And my 81-year-old aunt was like, you better write it so I can read it or I'm not going to pick it up. So I decided to start with this chapter that dated back to the 90s. And so I literally start the book on this wintry night that I'm in Chicago at this computer lab, get ready to go home. And a young girl knocks on the door, and they used to call me Miss Nicol. Miss Nicol, I have to do my homework. You cannot leave. And he opens up the door, and I got my coat on. If you ever lived in Chicago, I'm like I'm bundled. I'm ready to go. I was at Northwestern at the time, and she came in and she's like, "No, we have to do the homework because we had just upgraded those 386 computers to gateway computers. So we now had like a little bit more computing power. The computers actually work. I had worked out this deal with a DSL provider who was providing cell service on the top of the building. And so I was a hustler because I was still in New York or in Chicago, which makes a really interesting combination. But we were able to get some access, in this 300 square foot place. So this was the place to go after school. All the kids would rush in, and then the seniors would come in and hang out. And we used to call ourselves over the years, because I would always engage community people, like the barber shop and the beauty shop of this building, because people were coming to get on the computers, but then they wanted to gossip. So this young lady walks in, I'm ready to go because I've been there all day. I would go to class and then I would come here. And literally, she couldn't do her homework. Now, we talk about the homework gap with FCC Chairman Jessica Rosenworcel, but this homework gap started in the 90s because Kiana, she couldn't get to the library because it was closed. She didn't have the encyclopedia like I did when I was growing up because she didn't have a mom. She lived with a grandma, and she didn't have internet access in her home. And she had a paper that was due that she wanted to do really well with. And so I actually start the book by how I used to do this all the time, which was take off my hat, take off my gloves, put my coat down, turn on the computer, and sit there with the kids. I just used to love it. That was like the most fulfilling times of my life until I had my own kids. But she, for me, along with Evelyn and Beverly and so many others and Max and so many other people I've met, still stay in touch to this day through Facebook, used to come to the lab because they had to find a job, they had to apply for benefits, and sometimes they just wanted to shop. There was this one woman, she could not read, but she liked to go online to shop because she could figure out the photos and what she could click. And I'm just 18, 19. I went to grad school at 19. So I'm just 19, 20 experiencing this. So for me, what's so interesting, while I was doing this, I was still working on my PhD, which was in collective social movements. So I was a huge civil rights researcher, very interested in the history of the civil rights movement. So just imagine this life. I'm in class during the day doing my history on the history of the civil rights movement and the role of the middle class and social mobility. And at night or in the afternoon through the late evening, I'm sitting in a computer in the middle of Chicago. But you know my behavior, you know my personality. That didn't stop there. Mm-hmm. And then over time, when people would ask me, because they would come to the lab, this is around the time President Clinton also was giving money to affordable housing through the Neighborhood Networks program. So because we had this really full lab, we started getting all this money. It wasn't much, $1,500, $2,000, I'll never forget it, they would come. But that led me to say, while I was doing my research, there's something here. Now stay with me, folks. This was before mobile connectivity. We're not talking about smartphones. I don't even think we had a BlackBerry at the time, to tell you the truth. This was before wireless. This was an internet connection through a wall, a big base computer. I mean, having a Mac was a luxury, and we finally got funded. We had a wish list on the wall, and we finally bought a Macintosh because the kids wanted to do hip hop beats. So we made, in the utility room, we took the closet, which was even smaller, we soundproofed it. We put a hip hop booth in there. But this was in a time when technology is not like what it is today. When I tell my kids who are 17 and 22, like what I went through, they're like, huh? I mean, I'm like, yeah, this is the time we're using pencils and turning cassette tapes, and it was that time, CDs. That for me, though, Stephen, to your point, I don't know what clicked for me there. I'm a sociologist. I believe in equity, structural inclusion, looking at discrimination, racism. This is like the space I live in. I tell people a sociologist just has a different methodological approach and ideology when it comes to how we research stuff. Different from a political scientist, different from an economist. But I'm a true researcher in looking at this confluence of structures. And I don't know what clicked for me after that 300 square foot lab, but I knew something was up. And I've been stuck ever since. I mean, honestly, I think what really stuck for me was 9/11 hit. I'm from New York. And I talk about in the book, I was scheduled to get married 4 days after. I'm divorced from that first husband, so there probably was a reason. But was a reason I should have got married near 9/11. But I did. I talked about that in the book a little bit. But 9/11 hit and all of the TSA jobs, the transportation jobs at the airport had just gotten created. And all of a sudden, a flood of people said, we have to come to this lab because we cannot apply in person. And ever since then, I think that day when I saw the lab go from 20 little kids, to now adults and seniors, I was hooked. Because here I was now helping people apply for civil service jobs that they could not get. You remember that time, Larry? They couldn't get it no other way. They were like, I can't apply anywhere. I gotta have a resume, Miss Nicole. And the computer lady was back in action. And I stayed in action up until now, which is now 30 years later. I'm still doing the same thing.
Amazing, amazing. There's a wonderful phrase you use in the book a couple of times, and it's race, place, and space. Can you unpack that wonderful phrase for us?
Yeah, so here I am 30 years later now doing this book, right? I mean, I've been in the space for so long. And I decided when I wanted to do this book at Brookings that I would go to places and visit them. So again, Apple had set me up to go to Garrett County, Marion, Alabama, and actually see the school there because it's really charismatic principal they had told me about. I wanted to see her. I'd been in a presentation, I think with Microsoft, and I heard about a farming community 3 hours outside of here. So in my book, I visit farming communities, Black rural communities, predominantly Latina communities, senior communities, impoverished communities, and suburbs. And one of the common themes that I saw among farmers, in addition to, let's say, urban Black communities, is still this need to be connected to do really critical things. So let me give you an example on health. Let me just take health as an example. I went to West Phoenix, Arizona to visit a school that had tablets that had come from the Obama administration. And in this school, just as a sidebar, they were predominantly Latina. Every child had a cell phone, but they didn't have a cell phone to do homework. You read this in the book. They had it because they lived in Maricopa County, and there was a possibility that a parent could be deported or detained, and that was their phone tree. Teacher was really clear. They're not signing up for reduced price lunch. They're not using it for work. They're really using the cell phone to stay in touch with a family member. So I took a ride about 5 minutes away from the school, drove down there, and I ran into a woman who was screaming about getting a library card. Her name was Frances. She was like, I need a library card. I overheard her. I went out to her, told her I wasn't a caseworker, police officer. I just wanted to know why she needed a library card. She told me she had just been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, and she needed to get to the computer to actually communicate with her doctor. That's health. In a community predominantly people of color, urban. She's using a public library to check her private medical records because she cannot do that at all. Similarly, I went to a place that was a predominantly white community, a farming community, Garrett County, Maryland, near Deep Creek. If you've ever been there, about 3 hours outside of DC. There, I ran into a caseworker and health worker who told me it takes them 2 hours to get to a patient's home, this highly agricultural farming community, more cows than people, 2 hours to get back to the office to put the case notes in, and 2 weeks to go back on a return visit. And by that time, they're not sure what the health condition of the patient is. This was in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic, that people were dealing with the same struggles. So what dawned on me when I was working on my argument is that people are in, obviously, categories of structural inequality, race being one of them. I also talk about the LGBTQ community in there. I tried to depoliticize and deconstruct what has happened to the digital divide over years. But most importantly, people live in places and spaces where they don't have access. And for me, that was a different turn on how we've talked about the digital divide in Washington. We tend to think of it as urban over rural. We tend to think of it as housing versus community, right? And we tend to prioritize how we fund these things. We put more money in rural and less in urban because we think, well, there's more connectivity challenges in rural communities than there are in urban. We tend to forget that there are things like healthcare and education that overlay with digital outputs, which is why I call the digital divide a social determinant of well-being and health. But for me, I began to see in this very polarized world that we live, that the farmers who were living in Garrett County, which is the highest rate of opioid addiction, the highest rate of chronic disease, because white people have health disparities too, was just as chronic and consequential as that young sitting in the parking lot trying to get her lab results in the public library. That's why I say race places.
I love it. I love it. Now, you gave out a shout out to the Clinton administration. I'd love to hear from Larry a little bit later. But you also shouted out the Obama administration. Guess what? Bush administration had some programs, even Trump. And of course, Biden probably has the biggest program of them all. Talk about programs, because you have some interesting insights. Actually, going all the way back to the New Deal, I had to completely reassess what I thought about the New Deal and rural electrification.
Yes. Yeah, for those of you, like I kind of, as a sociologist and as a person who lives in popular culture, particularly in digital culture, I started realizing like there were languages that we were assigning to certain things that also didn't make sense. So the New Deal thing came because I was interviewing Representative Jim Clyburn on my podcast. And I kept saying, we need a tech New Deal. And he interrupted me after the third time. And he said, baby girl, the New Deal was not good for Black people. We cannot keep saying it's a New Deal. We need a re-engineering, a rethinking of this. So I went back in my history books and I was like looking it up and he was right? But we had assigned that, particularly Biden had assigned that in all honesty, to this technology revolution when we kept saying we're going to create a New Deal post-pandemic. So that's one of the reasons why I also sort of deconstruct digital divide. You notice in the book, I don't use digital divide as the end of the story. I use digitally invisible because they are even more so undercounted, unknown. Nobody knows about Frances in the library parking lot trying to get her breast cancer records. Nobody knows about the people in Garrett County who are only getting, nominal medical care because it's a farming community. Their topography is so high. Nobody knows about, the young day worker in Staunton, Virginia, Joseph, who only gets work halfway through the month because he can't pay his minutes or his data caps prevent him from actually getting access to information. So for me, that whole play on language, the same thing with rural electrification. While rural electrification is a mantra that we commonly use when we talk about broadband networks, not everybody lives in rural and not many people in the diaspora of our country benefited from rural electrification. So I really wanted to Stephen, and you do this well at FOSI, is deconstruct some of the ways in which we look at it, because I do think when we look at policy issues by particular language, we fund them that way. We counter, for example, with the money we have with the Biden-Harris administration, which is the largest allotment I've seen in my lifetime, we still say it's all about the networks and the fiber and this, when meanwhile, there are people who are using a variety of technologies in communities. They're using hybrid technologies. They're using satellite and fixed wireless and wireline, but we're tethered to that because our appropriation says it's just about fiber. Or when we lost, it was such a travesty in this country. In fact, being an author was really hard with the Affordable Connectivity Program because I had it in there, then I had to erase half of it, then I had to go back and put a little bit in, and then I had to come back and take it all out, right, before it went to publication. But for me, part of the bipartisanship, the fact that we couldn't get the partisanship had a lot to do with, one, my book wasn't out so people couldn't read it, but two, that really what we were talking about was a revamp of universal service. And the biggest amendment we made to our Lifeline program as a country since Ronald Reagan. And so there are definite trends for me in terms of how we talk about these issues and the policies that we grant alongside of them, but we are missing the people and communities. And I hope that resonated with you.
It did. And before we get to the blueprint for how you're going to solve all of this,
I know, right?
Or we're all going to solve it. Tell us the story about the Chinese woman and her scarves.
I know.
I mean, it's not just this country you go and, mess with
all
people.
Over.
You go off to China too. Tell us that story.
Yeah, I mean, once you get into tech policy, you're just in it, right? So when I came to DC after leaving Chicago, I became the sociologist among a lot of lawyers. And I became the person who could basically represent impacted populations because I just spent most of my the early part of my career in cities and communities, knowing what their needs were as the internet was changing. So you remember me, I was on a panel a week you can find us like the lady on the Wheaties box. Like, yeah, she's here today, right? But I lost my train of thought. But I'm not
We're in
kidding.
China.
Okay, so,
You need a scarf.
so I'm sitting there and I tell all these stories, right? And as I was speaking with the editor, shout out to Amber and to Daryl West from my team who helped keep me honest. I started thinking about things that I used to say when I first started in DC. Why is it that we're seeing mobile banking in other countries? We don't see it here. Why is it that mobile health is happening in Africa and it's not happening here? And I used to ask those questions in the State Department when I was very, very green. So I had this opportunity to go to China when I went to Brookings, about 5 times I've been there, to the World's Internet Conference. And what you can tell in the book, because I had to tell a lot about myself, so I'm a true Virgo. We tend to be very introverted, but I became very extroverted. We're extroverted on panels, but we're introverted on a regular time. See, people shaking their head, you know what I'm talking about. So I wanted to tell people, because I told so much at the beginning of the book about myself at the end of the book, right? And so I have a couple of funny stories about, I think I tell the story about people think I was Michelle Obama too in China. There's not a lot of Black people walking around there. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little shorter though. So at the World Internet Conference, I peeled off from the group and I found my way through a small water town. And the small water town under a bridge. So I'm from New York, nothing can stop us. We just go around and we walk around and we think it's okay, right? So I'm underneath this bridge, away from the conference, saying hello to all the people in China. I don't speak Chinese, but I'm very cordial. And I'm looking for something. I don't know what it is, but I stumble upon this market. And this 88-year-old woman in this market, because they have these beautiful cashmere scarves. And I was like, oh, I'm going to buy some of these, And I get ready to pay, and I have my cash, and she pulls out a QR code on her phone in this market where I have just like been hit almost by so many bikes and chickens. I'm just like walking through this town, and she pulls out a phone, and she doesn't speak any English. I don't speak any Chinese, and she shows me the QR code. My first instinct is like, this lady got a QR code in this part of town. Like, I can't get one sometimes. I can't get an Uber in Anacostia. She's got a QR code in this small water town, right? Well, it turns out the country is so advanced, despite its surveillance tactics and other stuff, but they've made a point of ensuring that rural communities have internet access. So I tell that story at the end because, for one, it brings to me some shame as a person here, that we've had this issue for 30 years. And here I'm walking into this wonderful water town. And as a matter of fact, I've gone for like 5, 6 years. So every time I go, I see this woman. And now I've met her grandchildren. Today, of all my visits and travels there. But it dawned on me, Stephen, like when I was there, I was like, why aren't we doing this in the United States? Like, why are we here? And I'll share this in particular, before I go to the blueprint. I also work in the age of AI. So I do a lot of, as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in non-discriminatory anti-racist AI. And I look at the way in which we've developed and designed AI over the years, but we've done it in a way where it's been transformative on many respects, particularly in healthcare, education, et cetera. But it's had some areas in which we've not been inclusive in the design. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how we design these products to really surface the lived experiences of subjects, but also how do we interrogate them so that we keep people safe? Because as a person who's been in the internet space for so many years, I'm still protective of Kiana, who discovered the internet to do her homework. I'm still protected of people that I've met over my decades of doing this who have more so have had no agency over how these products are developed, but they know they need to use it because as jobs and other things move online, they have no choice, and the pandemic showed us that. And so for me, it became really clear to me meeting this woman and then doing other travels that we in the United States, there are 2 things that we're not getting right. We know how to do this because we managed to actually do the digital TV transition over 2 administrations, but we managed to now that all of us don't have to use rabbit ears. We figured out how to get people their certificates and coupons to actually migrate to new technology. Probably the worst thing that we did with that transition is we didn't make the TVs here in the United States, so we didn't create jobs. But we know how to transition people to technology. Intuitively, the pandemic showed us through certain policies, we could get more people on healthcare. Like I've been in telehealth for 20 years. It took the stroke of a pen during the pandemic for people to actually use telehealth. So in my mind, we know how to do this. And we have the ingenuity of companies that also are domained here that know how to do this.
Yeah.
But that experience in China said, but do we want to do it? Do we want to surface invisible people? And that's where I still stay stuck because there were so many other people I probably could have met and many other stories I could have told. Hopefully do a documentary of some sort, because I think it's not about the technology, it's about the people and the spaces and the places in which they live. But at the end of the day, we have to have the political will. This is not a partisan issue, right? And that's where I continue to struggle. This is not an issue of partisanship. Because when those people in the communities I visited lose, we lose as a country. Because no one can work in those jobs. They cannot touch, experience, and feel those things. They can't be like that 80-year-old woman who, with confidence, has a QR code that can say, this is how I actually do my merchants and how I communicate. There's too many people that are bunkered and they can't do that. And we as a country have the will, the bandwidth, the wit, the ingenuity, the intellect to do it, but yet we still treat this on the fringes of everything important to our well-being.
Wow. We have representatives from Apple, Netflix, Amazon, who all do documentaries, it turns out. So we can introduce you to these people.
Please do.
I think it would be an amazing one. I want to just take a little sense of the room right now, and I actually want to call on you, Larry. Just reactions, comments, questions. What are you feeling right now, having heard all of this?
I'm on the back of the book with my feelings.
Oh,
I got it early.
Shall I just read it out?
But no, I mean, it's so important. This is a 35-year adventure.
That's right.
But actually, Lifeline, I was actually one of the architects of the Lifeline program. So the ACP program, when we came out of Lifeline, something I worked on with Congressman Mickey Leland in the mid-'80s. And so exactly what Nicol is talking about, Dr. Turnerly is talking about is my experience. It's about people. Lifeline comes out of my lived experience coming out of Brooklyn, New York, and knowing that 1 out of 4 people in New York in the 1980s didn't have a landline telephone. And so when I got to the Commerce Department in 1993-94, it was imperative to me that we not see this internet revolution. But I also knew that data mattered. And I also knew making open data, giving that data to everyone on the planet to use was important. I've got to change one thing. Sadly, technology has always been partisan, and it's unfortunately always hurt people who need it most. You go to San Francisco, there's a museum, and you can see this wonderful painting, work of art called New Light by a Black artist. What New Light was about 1935, 36, when they were electrifying the nation. Black farmers were looking down the road and seeing white farmers were lit up. And by law, the Black farmers couldn't get lit up. Imagine a 5 or 10 year period during the Depression when one family, subsistence farmer has light, another family doesn't. One family has refrigeration, another family doesn't. The same thing was happening with the internet. And while what troubled me was that the digital divide, the Bush administration would not use the term, they used digital inclusion. The Trump administration came back to using the term digital divide, but only with regard to rural. They weren't talking about low income people. And this is about people who are low income or have handicaps or single parents or English as a second language. It's about all of us. And so for Dr. Turner Lee to shine a light on this is so important. But as important as this is, it took the pandemic for us to do something about it. And then the minute the pandemic was over, we discontinued ACP. We gave tens of millions of people access to the internet, and then we turn around and take it back from them as soon as they're getting used to it and learning how to use it. And then we're going to say, you can only get to certain colleges if you have certain grades and certain board scores, and these families don't even have access to the internet.
Apply to get their financial aid.
One last story. Just before the pandemic in 2019, I went up to John Jay College to talk about CUNY and internet and the digital divide. And I had young students, Black students, white students, Latino students who were telling me they were doing their term papers at City University of New York, 503,000 students. The students were using their iPhones to do their papers. Fully 50% of the kids who were in CUNY at that point did not have internet access at home. In the greatest city, in the greatest country, or the richest city in the richest country in the world, 50% of kids at CUNY in 2019 did not have internet access at home. It's insanity. And so all I can do is shout commendations, because we need to continue to talk about this story. It's a 40-year journey for me. For those of you who aren't even 40 years old in this room, I hope it's not a 40-year journey for you.
Only 30 for me.
Exactly.
I didn't mean to talk that long, because I think we're gone by now, but.
I can answer Larry, that is the reason why I wrote the book, right? Because there was not comprehensive book, right?
Right.
And I was feeling, having been, in Chicago in that computer lab and been part of these different communities, that we were tossing this term around, right? And Larry's complete, I talk about that, right? Like all of a sudden, digital divide is about rural for Trump. Before that, it was about schools. And I was like, so when Brookings gives us the opportunity to write a book, and there's a lot of stuff that I do facial recognition, I wanted to write it about this issue. And it was tough because when you're so close to it as an author, it's hard for you to like disentangle what your argument is. But I also wanted to write the book to people like Larry. This is also an ode to my father, but it's an ode to my friend. Really. And Nicol Powell, who was is a dear friend and mentor. John Palfrey, who's at the MacArthur. The people in the back of the book I've known literally for 25 plus years, because we were all in this in some way for trying to solve this issue. So for me, you see me talk about this on social media. I actually don't call it a book. I call it a movement, right? I think it's a movement around elevating the conversation of digital equity. I recently had the opportunity to go to Spelman College as part of my 3-week tour and speak to young people at an HBCU about this journey, about how I got here. And the most beautiful thing happened. One of the girls came up to me and she said, I didn't do really well in math, so I decided I was going to be a computer scientist or data scientist. My mom has been pushing me because my dad's an engineer, but what you just said told me that I have a role to play in this.
Nice.
And for me, if I can get more people to sort of take and capture that role, whether they're gaming, whether they're sitting in a classroom, whether they're corporations like you all today, I've spoken to corporations, community leaders, digital equity leaders, you name it, church pastors, I'm talking to them. Because what I found in like my journey from my invisibility as an individual in tech, that is often a hidden figure. Yesterday, the White House honored the 3 ladies who were the hidden figures in the NASA space launch almost 60 years later from when they worked there. One of them is dead, Katherine Johnson, but the other woman is stepped on behalf. And I watched that and I thought, let's give flowers now. While we're here. And for me, that's the conversation I want to actually listen to the book. Where are the flowers so we can elevate these conversations that are happening locally among great, shepherds here in DC, like my friend here? And how do we get people to see that there's probably some shared aspirations and goals in this conversation more than we think? Other very vitriolic issues.
That's great. One other thing, you mentioned all the documentarians. I'm chairman of the board of PBS. We do a little bit of documents. I don't get involved with regard to documentaries. I don't get involved with the content, but I do know the people who do.
Yeah.
So there are others, Netflix and Amazon, you're going to jump on it. And you know something.
No,
Storytelling doesn't matter.
Let's talk to this guy.
I will talk to him.
But I'll tell you the people at PBS. I'm one of those chairmen who do not get involved in content as no chairman
Of course, Larry, of course you don't.
I do not.
It's a beautiful story to tell you the truth. Every time I tell the stories, just because that's who I am. I did an event at Brookings just a couple weeks ago, and I brought the people who I spoke to the stage of Brookings. And I didn't moderate the panel. I just let them get up there. And Dr. Trimble, who is the principal I've been in Alabama, she had a lot to say. And people absolutely fell in love with her.
Yeah.
Because that's what we do. We want you to fall in love with them.
Well, I fell in love with the characters in your book, including you, by the way, because you are. That's true. That's true. I was already biased. What questions, what thoughts are in the room? Sorry. Are we live, by the way? Although I saw we had some
We take
technical,
back anything that was off the record.
and I have no idea when we turned live, but for a while.
You started, yep.
That's fantastic. Well done. Welcome, the rest of the world. And we'll take questions from you too. Just say, questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I don't want to preempt the blueprint, but
Tell us who you are.
Andrew Zach, policy manager with FOSI. But I'm so curious, as we said, 5 administration journey, so much money with BEAD funding through the Treasury, through Commerce, through all of these initiatives. Like, what is that going to work? Is that helpful? Like, is it empowering states, and like the equity requirements, which are often bemoaned in Congress, like are so important clearly. So I'm just curious about maybe that is leading to the blueprint, but.
Yeah, I mean, we have reason to be concerned right now. Obviously, we're in election season. This program sort of started halfway through the administration in terms of the allocation of funds. We've already had 2 hearings where people from Commerce Department have been brought up FCC before Congress to sort of talk about the efficacy of these programs. I'm worried, in particular, because these programs take time. You've got not only states that just got their money, but they've got to dig in a little bit on their plans. And so again, it has the potential to be partisan again. And so based on who gets into the White House will definitely dictate where we land on this issue. And as Larry mentioned, post-pandemic, the murmur has gone down a little bit. Even though technology is integrated into everything that we do, we have to have digital equity before we actually have AI. Keep telling people that I've testified about before then. So with that being the case, with all this money that we have, it will be interesting. Now we've seen digital equity money come out. It's nominal compared to the infrastructure money. I've been around certain groups that are actually thinking about what they want to do with this money. They put out their plans, now they're trying to figure out how to implement it. I think the bottom line is there will be some really wonderful things that come out of the BEAD funding. Whether or not it's going to solve
Spell out BEAD.
broadband equity,
Familiar accessible.
affordability,
No idea.
BEAD, look it up on Commerce, right? I write about it so much I forgot what it stands for. But my point is that funding is definitely going to be critical, but it's also going to be contested.
Mm.
And so we just have to be mindful that voting and elections matter. And that's at all levels, because governors are the ones that are actually running many of those funds as well. I was quite surprised, for example, to read about Tim Walz and what he's done in Minnesota and how he's actually activated his state around digital equity. Potentially that could be his turn of events. Obviously Harris was alongside Biden with regards to the investments here. She's mentioned broadband a couple of times, but I was a little disappointed. We used to play the drinking game back in the days on how many times we heard broadband at a convention of this. It was maybe 3 times. I've heard 3 times. There was referenced by a rural broadband by Nancy Pelosi, at the DNC at least, a reference on AI, and one other reference. But, this tends to go into, the dark when it's not, doesn't have a microscope on it. So my hope is that it's going to be used successfully and we're going to see wonderful projects, but I'm not as optimistic on the same train. And so, part of the rationale of, if we get into the blueprint, was sort of a pen, the way we've been doing stuff, which is one sizing many of these policy programs on internet access. We put a lot of money, we basically one size fits all rural programs. We've been doing the same thing for many, many years. We've grandfathered those programs. We've not changed them. The money's going in, but yet the impact may be small because it costs more to wire in those spaces. When it comes to affordability, we tend to put those programs in urban, even though they need infrastructure. And then we run that circle again in terms of appropriations, and we don't get anywhere. And so what I was suggesting is that we have a plan towards what universal service really looks like. We have a really key moment right now to look at our universal service program that was developed and designed when Larry was sitting on the other side of the doors, and think about its utility right now in this age of AI, right? And to think about ways in which the expansion of universal service is one that's a social service program, or one in which we would actually grow it. Because honestly, I could say this, I know I'm sitting at TikTok, but look, it's been based on the capital revenue of cable companies. And they have shrunk down, consolidated, in ways in which the money is being passed on to consumers. Or are there different ways that we can actually build that fund? I've been around so long, and when we talked about bringing it to National Treasury and doing this, I really think we need to have a really strong conversation on what does universal service of communications mean. We did it when we brought the telephone to people because we wanted them to have 911. And now we have to think the same way, and we may have to think differently on how we look at existing tech policy to do it. And then I also think, and I happen to run into the director of the Corporation for National Service, we need to look at places in which we can activate existing programs to just be different. So in the 90s, I had an AmeriCorps Vista. He was Romanian, he didn't speak any English, he got locked in the bathroom a lot by those bad kids, but guess what? He survived, had his child, and came out, and he did wonderful work for us because I was by myself. Today, AmeriCorps Vista probably has a bigger budget than it had when Clinton actually went there, even though it's always contested as well. But we could use that to create an actual digital service core. The Digital Navigator program that's under the BEAD program, once that funding is gone, so are those navigators. So part of my conversation of Blueprint is how do we institutionalize some of these funding and money so that we can make sure no child's left offline. We don't have to wait for a pandemic to actually know that. No worker is left behind wherever they live. They should be able to participate in a broadband job or some job that's being enacted because of internet access. And that we should think carefully about investing in communities. That's the last thing I'll say here. It was schools, libraries, and churches that helped us in the pandemic. The libraries left their parking lots open. The schools decided that they would find ways where kids could sit on their stoops safely. The local retailers decided they weren't going to shoo the kids away because they weren't purchasing anything. There were kids that sat in the parking lot of fast food restaurants and teachers. People don't know about the teachers who sat in that same parking lot and administered their lessons. But yet, they got a small portion of the monies that's out there right now. So we got to go back and sort of rethink how we building ecosystems around digital technology. And again, giving people more agency over ways in which they can actually mobilize their communities to do well.
One last question before we get to your solutions.
I'm trying to help you though.
You're helping anyone.
I can't.
Another book published this year, apart from yours, it's called The Anxious Generation
Oh, yes.
by Jonathan Haidt. And it's kind of bizarre because a lot of what has happened since that book has come out is blanket bans, trying to take access away.
Which I think is so interesting, right?
Well, that's hey, your interesting thoughts on that book and the sort of, and you're a sociologist, it's had a big social impact.
Well, that's part of the challenge, right? And that's why I said we have not been able to sort of dominate the tech space outside of being just a domain for really interesting and transformative companies, right? Because we see it as a transactional matter and not one in which it has a vested interest in our social mobility as a country. So what do I mean by that? So here I am saying, get the kids some broadband, right? And schools like my kids in Fairfax County are saying no cell phones in the classroom. Although I will say on tape that these kids don't need their cell phones, their notifications, they just do it through their laptops. I'm finding that out. I'm like, my daughter, I took away her phone the other day and she was like, ping, ping, ping on her laptop. And I was like, what is going on over there? She's like, oh, I get mine on my laptop. She said, if somebody could tell the superintendent that it's working around that. But I'd said it. If she's watching, I'm sorry, I had to put it out there. But when you have kids and you work in policy, they try to tell you stuff not to say because they don't want it to be banned. But I just said it. But for me, it's an interesting piece because in many respects, these bans have some systemic embedded power consequences and dynamics. Let me tell you what I mean. I've been on many panels where people have said, I've decided I want my child to be technology free. I don't want them to have access to technology. And I say, well, why is that? They said, because this is the thing that we've decided to do in our household, and we sort of think it's okay for schools not to have access. And they make those blanket bans based on their economic status, based on the fact that they probably have money for the kids to do other stuff. And I've been in many discussions around that, particularly with the age of generative AI, because we use that same language when we say, well, my child uses generative AI for critical inquiry, but the kid, again, in Anacostia, When he uses generative AI, he's accused of cheating.
Hmm.
So I think we have to be really careful that we're imposing these bans, sometimes based on the political views of people who want to be gatekeepers, additional gatekeepers to children's rights in their use of technology. I think it's really not about a ban, right? You don't want to ban a tool that ultimately is going to be part of the occupational schema of how people get jobs. And as much as we don't like kids to do research papers on their cell phones, how many of you in the recent months have had to sit on your cell phone or your smartphone and actually apply for your property license or get, like my husband loves to fish. It is never a surprise that we are at the gate of the park and we are on our phones getting him an updated fishing license. And thank goodness for that, because he does not want to be stopped by a police officer when he is trying to catch a bass or whatever he does out there. So we are constantly sitting as I talk about, sitting in some big box store who has internet, trying to get online to make sure we get his license. So for me, the thing that we may potentially be getting wrong is that, are we teaching kids and educators, particularly in schools or parents, the most appropriate uses of these technologies? I do agree, like at 3 years old, young people shouldn't be having a phone in their pocket, because most likely they just have it because the parent wants to make sure they contact them if they're running late. But at the same token, we have to engage in media literacy around these things. I mean, we talked about for many years. This is why, again, with language, I push back against things that are like digital literacy, because we've been talking about it so long, we don't even know what it means. When we talked about digital literacy then, we talked about people understanding how to use the tools to make the decisions that were right for themselves. Nowadays, we think that we should make decisions for everybody in their technology. And I think that is an overstep of giving people the right tools that they need to make better decisions and more informed decisions around technology. So what do I mean by that? My daughter, she has had to take driver's education in school for a good 2 semesters before she could get a license in Virginia. She's had to take reproductive health classes at school, particularly at that time when she has to know a little bit better about choices she's going to make about her body. But we never teach kids about digital literacy. Never. And that's what, we don't teach about safety. We don't teach them about, this is when you use it. This is how you use it. We've got all these great AI tools that are actually being enabled by these low-hanging fruits, games that are teaching kids how to read. But yeah, we still say, put your phone in a bag and leave it at the front door, because I don't trust that you as a child are going to do the right thing. So I've been sort of working on this blog about this, because I think that there's a lot that's telling about where we're going with the gatekeeping of technology, different conversations we've had before when it comes to competition, the gatekeeping of technology, and again, where we want to be as a society, and the extent to which we're going to let me put it this way. If someone had said to me, no, you cannot use that typewriter, and I was really good at that typewriter, because at that time, it wasn't Larry and Steve's typewriter, just so you're clear. It was the one that you could actually hit the button and it would erase it and then go back. They had the one that you had to go like this.
I know.
And white out, right? The one I had, at least you could actually reverse it and then it would take the white out automatically. Could you imagine if somebody had said to a person in the classroom, no, you can't have access to a typewriter? No, you can't have access to these. Change the way we live, we learn, we earn. So I'm stuck, because I think that this, where we're seeing the view based on that book, because I'm in all these conversations like, no, there should be no technology, no. I'm like, that's what they said to us. And we turned out okay. But the difference in this technology, which we have to do, which makes the mission of FOSA even more important, is that we need a more hands on deck, because there are bad actors that can do
Sure.
really bad things with the new enhanced capabilities of technology.
Sure.
That we've not been able to legislate or regulate yet.
All right. Now, take us home.
Take you home.
Take me home. So what are your ideas, blueprints, thoughts? How are we gonna reconcile all of this?
First and foremost, we need to revamp universal service and make it make sense. If I could just make it make sense that in the 21st century digital age today, that can actually be future-proofed into the going forward. I think that's the first step. We have a bipartisan commission on this. I've spoken to one of the people on that commission. I think they're looking for great ideas. I'd encourage anybody is to continue to give good ideas. Nothing is a bad idea at this point, I think. We need universal services, not just for individuals, where schools don't have to decide between whether or not they're gonna fund, and it's so unfortunate, a metal detector in their school or a laptop. We need something that makes sense so that schools are not feeling in pandemic response, begging for those resources. I'm so sad by all the schools that use the pandemic relief money to get laptops, they've had to give them back, or they've had to stop the program simply because we didn't have an urgency around this. So that's the first thing. That blends into having policies in place that honor the fact that there are people in communities that need to be competitive in this digital age. This is not about digital divide, folks. This is about digital competitiveness. What does that look like? It means that we just don't need tech companies at the table. We need everybody at the table. There's no one company that's not a tech company. So I see an interest in this by banks. I see an interest by healthcare providers. I see everybody who touches something digital should be at the table in policy and programmatic discussions, because this is where you're gonna get your next workforce. So I think that's another way we can change the way we look at these issues from being just technology vacuumed in one space and open it up to other people. I think we would do much better in our country when it comes to making sure people are connected. I think we need to look at spaces and places as ecosystems for tech development, right? I really wanted to prove that point. Like, there are spaces in which people are negotiating how to get connected every day, but yet they don't come to Washington. They're not sitting, in front of us. They're not watching our Zooms. They're just figuring it out. And I think we need to honor and figure out with them, co-create with them so that they stand at the table. One of the things that happened at my Brookings event on my book, and I told you I had like the second panel, our dear friend John Hendel, did the interview of the book. You and him are cutting a close tie there. I feel so dignified and honored with my friends talking to me. So thank you. But
It made me cry.
I know afterwards, the people were up there, and John Whithausen actually talked to them from schools and libraries.
Yeah.
And what was so nice is somebody asked a question like, so Dr. Trimble, principal in Marion, Alabama, what do you think about privacy? She turned around, she said, I know you all need the privacy, but that's not what I'm worried about in Alabama. I'm worried about whether or not my kids are gonna have technology access so they can become dreamers and imagine their futures. We need more of her here, helping us reimagine what it means to be in these spaces where tech is determining and changing and motivating our lives. And so for me, that's the beginning. I mean, people asked me, there were a couple things I wanted to do better in the book. I wanted to talk more about sovereign lands. I met various Indigenous people, but I have felt like I didn't do a good job of being able to tell their story in this book. So I want to be able to tell their story, maybe through a documentary. I wanted to do more with Latina communities and others who are invisible. I felt I could do more. And I think we need to do more in actually telling their story as well, because language does present itself differently, also among Asian American communities. Always talk about, well, Asian American people are all connected. Not if you're from Southeast Asia, not if you live in certain parts of San Francisco. It's the same socioeconomic, this intersection of race, place, and space. So I feel like I want to tell that story differently. And most importantly, what's next? I'm just waiting for a time where I can get a good night's sleep. Have yet to get a good night's sleep. As a first-time author who has written a lot of stuff, there's something about this experience that is just so wonderful. Not only do I get to talk about my policy friends like all of you, but I get to talk about it with my family, my friends, who are actually like looking at me like, I had a senior citizen lady come up to me the other day. I was talking about my book. She was there at an event I had. It was public. And she came up to me. She said, I don't know much about what you're talking about, except that I know that I'm that invisible person. I'm a senior. Who do I talk to get online? So for me, that's like what's next, like talking to more people and engaging communities in ways that make sense for them. But yeah, I just need a good night's sleep to do it though. Because I can tell you, I am not sleeping. I have everybody in my house off their sleeping schedules. My dog is not sleeping the way she is because I can't get up in time to take her out at normal 5:30. She looked at me the other day like, listen, you need to go to bed on time because I need to go out at this time. My poor kids are hungry. My husband is over there struggling. It's a journey, right? And so I'm thinking my next step is to get a good night's sleep somewhere in between there, but to keep spreading this gospel until, Larry, somebody listens to us and listens to us in a discreet way where this is part of the way we talk about everyday life. So that's
Well,
what's next.
you promise us to get that rest and then come back and talk some more about other people that you now will have met.
No.
And we'll see if we can help you take it forward. You should also send it, there's this woman called Oprah.
She's
likes-
worried about a whole lot of other stuff.
She really likes to read, it turns out.
She does. If anybody knows her, I'm looking for her. information.
We've got lots of media outlets in the room. We'll
Yes.
put you in touch. Thank you very much for sharing this.